Picture a man chopping off 10 million hands and being rewarded with a solid gold statue. Meet King Leopold II of Belgium. He sits behind an oak desk brushing invisible dust off pristine white gloves. His unblinking reptilian eyes scan a map of the Congo, while a faint predatory smirk stretches across his face. Beneath this composed shell boils a paralyzing terror of dying as an insignificant footnote in European history. To cure this insecurity, he orchestrated the most ruthless corporate heist ever recorded. He did not send any army to conquer a nation. He swallowed a landmass 76 times larger than his own country and turned it into his private slaughterhouse. 10 million human beings were exterminated to bleed the jungle dry of rubber and ivory. Logic dictates a psychopath of this magnitude ends up at the gallows. But reality is a sick joke. He walked away with billions in cash and was immortalized as a benevolent builder king. How did a mediocre monarch execute the perfect genocide and get the world to thank him for it? He weaponized the ultimate shield, a fake humanitarian charity. He wore the flawless mask of a weeping philanthropist begging to civilize the savage darkness. And here is the ultimate twisted paradox. The global elite did not just let him do it, they voluntarily emptied their own bank accounts to finance his killing machine. What exact hypnotic lie did he feed the world to make them eagerly sponsor a Holocaust? The late 19th century was an era of titans and unchecked greed. The scramble for Africa was in full swing. Giant empires like Britain, France, and Germany were carving up the globe like a massive bleeding pie. They were bloated with unprecedented wealth and military might, displaying their colonial trophies to the world. The earth was a grand chessboard, and the monarchs of Europe were the grandmasters moving human pieces across oceans. But then there was Belgium, a tiny newborn speck on the map. A country so microscopically insignificant, it was essentially a convenient buffer zone created to keep its powerful neighbors from killing each other. Leopold sat on a velvet throne that felt more like a claustrophobic gilded cage. He was a king in name, only restricted by a tight constitution that stripped him of any absolute authority. He spent his days trapped in his palace, pacing the marble floors with a stiff, rigid posture. He would obsessively align the silver inkwells and parchment on his mahogany desk, ensuring every single item was perfectly symmetrical. It was a pathetic physical compulsion to control the small objects in front of him to compensate for the chaotic powerlessness he felt on the world stage. He wore the public mask of a polite, constitutional monarch, nodding and smiling amiably at boring parliamentary meetings. But beneath that pleasant facade, a suffocating terror clawed at his chest. His absolute deepest psychological vulnerability was a paralyzing fear of mediocrity. He was terrified of rotting in the ground as an irrelevant footnote, a forgotten king of a country that nobody cared about. He desperately needed a colony. He needed a vast overseas empire to validate his own existence. The true depth of his agonizing humiliation was exposed during a lavish royal banquet in London. The Grand Hall was dripping with the stolen wealth of a global empire. Diamond chandeliers illuminated the smug, arrogant faces of men who ruled millions of subjects across the globe. Leopold stood awkwardly in the corner, nursing a glass of champagne, trying to assert his presence. He cautiously approached a prominent British lord, hoping to discuss international trade and perhaps carve out a tiny sliver of respect. The towering British aristocrat did not even bother to turn his body to fully face the Belgian king. He simply glanced over his shoulder, his cold eyes sweeping up and down the modest royal attire of Leopold. The aristocrat smirked, a condescending sneer stretching across his face, and delivered a sentence that would inadvertently seal the fate of millions of innocent lives. Your Majesty must find it incredibly relaxing to rule a nation so microscopic that one could actually walk across its entire border in a single afternoon without even noticing. The surrounding diplomats burst into a chorus of arrogant laughter. Leopold froze. He did not blink. His reptilian eyes locked onto the laughing aristocrat with a dead, hollow stare. The public mask remained glued to his face in the form of a tight, polite smile, but beneath it, a dark, terrifying awakening violently took hold. He slowly lowered his champagne glass, his knuckles turning pure white as he squeezed the fragile crystal stem. He swallowed that venomous insult and let it digest into pure malice. The arrogant lord was absolutely right. A crown without vast land and endless resources was just a useless piece of decorative jewelry. Respect in this brutal world was not inherited by bloodlines. It was bought with raw, unadulterated capital and the capacity for extreme violence. In that crowded ballroom, the humiliating joke became his twisted survival truth. If his weak country was too small to give him an empire, he would bypass them entirely and just buy a continent for himself. His dark motivation completely crystallized in that moment of public shame. He would acquire a colony not through the pathetic Belgian government, but as a private corporate entity. He would become a ruthless business titan wearing a royal crown. He knew he could never openly compete with the massive navies and armies of Britain or France. He needed a completely unconventional strategy to conquer a landmass. He needed a psychological mechanism that would blind the arrogant superpowers to his true psychopathic intentions. And that is exactly when the seeds of his monstrous open secret began to take root in his calculating mind. The very same hypnotic lie that would soon make those laughing aristocrats willingly hand him the keys to the Congo. The global powers were caught in a blind, rabid frenzy. It was a chaotic feeding frenzy like starving dogs fighting over a single piece of meat. Britain, France, and Germany were bleeding their treasuries dry, sending massive armies across oceans to claim foreign soil. They were trapped in a violent herd mentality, slaughtering each other over borders, building expensive forts, and taxing their citizens into poverty just to maintain their sprawling global empires. To them, conquering a colony meant war treaties and massive national debt. It was a brute force game played by arrogant men addicted to the smell of gunpowder. Leopold watched this bloody theater from the sidelines, his fingers rhythmically tapping the armrest of his chair in a fast, obsessive tempo. His public mask remained perfectly stoic, portraying the deeply concerned monarch praying for peace. But his unblinking eyes tracked their movements with the cold, calculating precision of a wolf watching fat sheep stumble into a trap. He saw the massive, glaring blind spot in their imperial strategy. Why buy the cow if you can steal the milk while the farmers are busy stabbing each other? He realized that claiming a nation did not require any army or a royal decree. It only required a corporate loophole. While the superpowers viewed Africa as a military conquest, Leopold viewed it as a hostile takeover. He would not conquer the Congo, he would incorporate it. He would use the very thing the aristocrats worshipped to blind them, their own bloated sense of moral superiority. He summoned his closest inner circle of corrupt lawyers and silent investors to his private study. The room was suffocatingly dark, lit only by the flickering glow of a single fireplace. He stood at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his hands folded perfectly behind his back. The facade of the gentle king vanished entirely, leaving only the hollow predatory void of a ruthless executive. A slight contemptuous smirk twitched on his lips as he delivered his arrogant declaration. "We will not send soldiers to die for dirt, my friends. We will send scientists and priests. Let the superpowers drown in their own blood over flags and borders. I will wrap my greed in the holy cloak of charity, and they will be so enchanted by the fake virtue that they will hand me the keys to the vault." This was his checkmate. In 1884, he manipulated the 14 most powerful nations on Earth to gather in Berlin. He did not ask them for land. He asked them for permission to save souls. He deployed his ultimate hypnotic lie, the very secret that would keep the world completely blinded to his upcoming genocide. He pitched them the International African Association, a supposedly independent philanthropic charity dedicated to fighting Arab slave traders and bringing free trade and civilization to the Dark Continent. He played into their deepest vulnerabilities, their desperate need to look like civilized saviors, while masking his own terrifying fear of insignificance. The superpowers were so relieved to have a neutral buffer state controlled by a harmless charity that they literally signed over a territory 76 times the size of Belgium directly to Leopold as a private citizen. The board was set. The trap was sprung. The killing machine was officially sanctioned. The machine activated with brutal precision. The corporate extraction of the Congo relied on 3 distinct pillars of manipulation designed to swallow the market whole while maintaining a pristine public facade. Pillar 1 was the micromechanics of absolute physical terror. Zoom in on the dense, humid jungle. A single drop of white latex slowly bleeds from a slashed rubber vine. It falls onto the bare chest of an exhausted Congolese villager. The sap is thick and sticky. It hardens quickly in the suffocating heat. To harvest it, the workers must coat their own bodies in the toxic sap and wait for it to coagulate. When they peeled the dried rubber from their skin, it rips away hair and flesh, leaving raw, bleeding wounds. This physical agony is meticulously calculated by the corporate overseers. Leopold established a strict quota system. Every village was assigned a specific weight of rubber to deliver by sundown. If the sales dipped even an ounce below the requirement, the corporate policy demanded physical amputation. The mercenary army known as the Force Publique was dispatched to enforce the ledger. To ensure his soldiers did not waste expensive imported bullets on hunting animals, Leopold instituted a grotesque accounting mechanism. Every bullet fired had to be accounted for with a physical human receipt. That receipt was a severed right hand. The soldiers collected baskets full of chopped hands. When the humid climate caused the flesh to rot, the soldiers smoked the hands over open fires to preserve them for the corporate auditors. The ledgers in Brussels did not record human lives. They recorded units of rubber and baskets of smoked limbs. Every page of the ledger was a testament to the cold efficiency of his operation. The accountants in Europe simply crossed out a village name and replaced it with a tally mark. Thousands of miles away, in a pristine palace, Leopold sat at his sprawling desk. His unblinking eyes scanned the ledgers of severed hands. He compulsively aligned the edges of the paper until they were perfectly parallel with the edge of his desk. His breathing was slow and measured. The paralyzing fear of his own mediocrity was temporarily sedated by the sheer volume of the numbers. He stroked his squared beard, a faint, hollow smirk stretching his lips. He picked up a solid gold pocket watch. Listened to the rhythmic ticking sound. Every tick represented another drop of rubber, another severed limb, another franc entering his hidden vault. He was the supreme executive of an empire built on amputations, but he knew violence alone could not sustain a monopoly. It required the second pillar, the flawless public illusion. Pillar 2 was the fabrication of a pristine moral reality. Leopold understood that the global elite would tolerate any level of cruelty as long as they did not have to physically look at it. He aggressively bribed journalists across Europe and the United States. He funded the printing of glossy magazines filled with staged photographs. These images showed well-fed African children standing in front of newly built wooden clinics. He funded lavish exhibitions in Brussels where wealthy patrons could walk through fake African villages. He placed healthy, smiling Congolese actors in these exhibits, completely hiding the skeletal, mutilated slaves dying by the thousands just out of sight. The public mask he wore was incredibly thick and completely impenetrable. He transformed the blood-soaked rubber into the currency of philanthropy. This allowed him to deploy his ultimate psychological weapon. He stepped onto a podium in a grand auditorium in Paris. The room was filled with wealthy aristocrats, politicians, and religious leaders. Leopold adjusted his pristine white gloves. His posture was rigid. He looked at the sea of naive faces with his dead reptilian stare. He knew their deepest psychological vulnerability. They suffered from a desperate need to feel morally superior without actually getting their hands dirty. He delivered his hypnotic pitch with a slow, soothing cadence. He told them that the darkness of the jungle could only be pierced by the light of their generosity. He looked directly into the eyes of a wealthy industrialist. He spoke softly, but his voice carried the heavy weight of calculated manipulation. Your contributions do not buy commodities, gentlemen. They buy salvation. Every franc you donate builds a roof over a starving child and a church for a lost soul. We are not extracting wealth. We are planting the seeds of civilization. The manipulation was flawless. The audience was completely spellbound by the hypnotic lie. They wept in their velvet chairs. They felt a profound sense of gratitude toward the man who was actively deceiving them. They eagerly opened their checkbooks and poured their generational wealth into his private accounts. They voluntarily financed the very bullets that were currently shattering the skulls of children in the Congo. They thanked him for the privilege of participating in this holy crusade. The victims of his manipulation were not just the mutilated laborers in the jungle. The victims were also the arrogant aristocrats who paid for the mutilations with a smile. With the funding secured and the public blinded, Leopold activated the third pillar: the absolute annihilation of all market competition. He completely sealed the borders of his private colony. He declared that all vacant land and all of its resources belonged exclusively to the state. And he was the state. Independent merchants and foreign traders who attempted to buy rubber directly from the villagers were branded as poachers. They were quietly hunted down by the force publique and buried in unmarked graves in the deep jungle. Leopold controlled every single river port and every trade route. He dictated the purchase price of rubber at zero and the selling price at whatever the global market could bear. The ports of Antwerp became a monument to his absolute monopoly. Cargo ships arrived daily from the Congo, weighed down by thousands of tons of premium red rubber and precious ivory. The dock workers marveled at the sheer volume of wealth flowing into the country. The smell of the raw rubber was thick and pungent, covering the scent of the dried blood that stained the cargo holds. But the true horror was what those same ships carried on their return voyage. They did not load shipments of medicine or school books or agricultural tools. The cranes lowered massive wooden crates filled entirely with military-grade rifles, chains, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The illusion was a perfect closed loop. The money from the fake charity bought the guns. The guns secured the rubber. The rubber generated massive profits. And the profits bought more journalists to print more lies to solicit more charity. Leopold watched the ships dock from the balcony of his palace. His dark psychological hunger was finally being fed. He was no longer the pathetic, insignificant ruler of a tiny buffer state. He was a global titan who had successfully engineered a perpetual motion machine of death and profit. He had conquered the global market not by defeating his enemies on a battlefield, but by turning the morality of the world into his own personal weapon. The public continued to worship his fabricated saintly image, completely unaware that the wealth building their beautiful new museums was directly converted from human blood. The secret lie he planted at the very beginning had grown into an impenetrable fortress of wealth, keeping the truth buried under mountains of gold while the gears of his machine kept turning. The delusion of godhood completely consumed him. Leopold paraded through his newly constructed royal greenhouses in Laeken, surrounded by exotic plants imported directly from the blood-soaked soil of the Congo. He believed his own hypnotic lie. He genuinely thought his massive stone monuments and golden arches had permanently cemented his legacy. He felt untouchable, insulated by billions of francs and a thick wall of bribed politicians. He compulsively straightened his diamond cufflinks, convinced he had achieved ultimate historical immortality. The fear of insignificance seemed utterly defeated. But his perfect corporate machine had a single fatal flaw, and it was not discovered by a rival army or a brilliant spy. His natural enemy was a nobody. An obscure 26-year-old shipping clerk named Edmund Dean Morel, standing on the docks of Antwerp. Morel was not looking for a genocide. He was just looking at the corporate ledgers. And the numbers did not add up. Morel noticed the massive paradox. Ships arrived from the Congo bursting with millions of francs worth of raw rubber and ivory. But the ships returning to Africa carried no currency, no humanitarian aid, no food. They carried only rifles, shackles, and massive quantities of military explosives. Morel deduced the horrifying truth hidden beneath the charity. You don't buy rubber with guns unless the labor is forced. The philanthropic shield was shattered by basic accounting. The walls began to close in with suffocating speed. The international press previously bought and paid for suddenly turned ravenous. Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle published brutal exposés. The public mask of the weeping philanthropist melted away, exposing the cold reptilian monster underneath. Inside his sprawling palace, Leopold experienced a total physiological breakdown. The perfectly rigid posture collapsed. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead, stinging his unblinking eyes. His manicured hands trembled violently as he furiously ordered his staff to destroy the evidence. For 8 consecutive days and nights, the furnaces of the royal palace roared. They burned tons of state archives, ledgers, and signed execution orders. Thick, black smoke choked the skies over Brussels. He frantically shoved papers into the fire, trying to burn the truth out of existence. His breathing was ragged. His desperate need to avoid humiliation drove him into a pathetic frenzy. He paced the ash-covered floor, muttering to himself that they had no right to look into his private affairs. Then came the fatal blow. The heavy wooden doors of the royal chamber echoed with 3 deafening knocks. It was not a rival king standing on the other side. It was the Belgian parliament, forced into action by global outrage. The door swung open, and the cold legal verdict was delivered straight to his face by the lead parliamentary minister. The game is over, Your Majesty. The international community demands an immediate, unconditional surrender of your private domain. The state is seizing the Congo. The absolute humiliation crushed him. The king, who had outsmarted 14 global superpowers, who had manipulated the entire world into financing his private holocaust, was stripped of his toy. He collapsed into his velvet chair, his pristine white gloves covered in the black suit of his burning empire. His desperate, terrifying fear of being exposed as a fraud had finally come true. The great builder king was publicly reduced to a pathetic exposed criminal, staring blankly at the ashes of his monstrous monopoly. Logic dictates that a man reasonable for 10 million corpses rots in a damp cell. That's the confronting illusion of justice we feed ourselves to sleep peacefully at night. We desperately want to believe the monster was punished when his empire finally collapsed. But history is written by the accountants. Leopold did not face a military tribunal or a hangman. The Belgian government did not indeed force him to surrender his massive private slaughterhouse. But they did not confiscate it. They bought it from him. They handed the exposed architect of a global genocide 50 million francs as a generous corporate buyout. He spent his final days resting in a silk bed, completely untouched by the law. His unblinking reptilian eyes stared out the window of his lavish palace, while his trembling hands obsessively aligned the velvet pillows to perfect geometric symmetry. His paralyzing fear of historical insignificance was permanently cured. He died an obscenely wealthy man and left behind a horrifying open truth that modern society still refuses to swallow. The ultimate hypnotic lie that built his empire was never about civilizing the Congo. The true lie was the delusion that civilized society actually values human life over cheap commodities. You look at his towering golden statues today and feel a sickening moral disgust. But you are completely missing the punchline of his sick joke. The public only condemned his barbaric methods when the severed hands became too visible on their morning newspapers. Yet they happily kept the beautiful architecture, the thriving economy, and the cheap rubber tires as blood money bought for them. The darkest axiom of human nature is not that monsters like Leopold exist. It is that as long as the victims are kept entirely out of sight and the profit margins are high enough, a polite society will always gladly hire a psychopath to do the dirty work.